How does a minor nobleman's son become the boyhood friend of the world's greatest conqueror? This is a question that sits at the heart of one of history's most fascinating and successful careers. It is a question of proximity to power, of character, and of unimaginable, world-altering luck. In the crucible of the Macedonian court, a hyper-competitive, violent, and ambitious world, friendships were not merely casual. They were alliances, potential rivalries, and the very foundation of future power. To be the friend of the heir, Prince Alexander, was to be marked for greatness or for death. This is the story of the one man who navigated this treacherous proximity, not just as a friend, but as a student, a soldier, and ultimately, a successor. This is the story of Ptolemy the general, who would watch the world's greatest conqueror rise, and who, when that conqueror fell, would be the only one cunning and ruthless enough to seize his own permanent piece of the wreckage. His journey from a peripheral figure in Pella to the god king of Egypt is a masterclass in how to turn a boyhood friendship into an immortal 300-year dynasty. We believe these incredible stories from the ancient world, tales of ambition, genius, and betrayal that shaped our reality, deserve to be told in detail. If you find this exploration of history compelling, please show your support by giving this video a like. To ensure you don't miss our future deep dives into the lives of the great figures of the past, please subscribe to the channel and ring the bell for notifications. And finally, the greatest way to support our work is to share this video with others who you believe would appreciate this fascinating story of the man who founded a dynasty. Ptolemy, the man who would found a dynasty, was born in the rugged mountainous kingdom of Macedon around 367 BC, a date which would place him in the same generation as the prince. He would come to serve just a few years Alexander's senior. His origins, however, are deliberately shrouded in the politically convenient mist of ancient history, a fog likely encouraged by his own later royal propaganda. The official and most humble version, the one that emphasized his own merits, is that he was the son of a minor nobleman named Lagos, from the obscure Macedonian region of Eordia. This would make him a man who rose purely on his own abilities. But another far more tantalizing rumor, one that whispered through the courts of his rivals, and was perhaps even subtly encouraged by his own dynasty in Egypt, claimed he was an illegitimate son of Philip II, Alexander's brilliant and ruthless father. If true, this would make him Alexander's half-brother, a secret royal bastard, and would retroactively grant his seizure of Egypt a veneer of familial, if not legal, legitimacy. What is certain, regardless of whether his blood was noble or truly royal, is his incredibly close bond with the young prince, Alexander. This was the defining relationship of his early life. He was brought into the Macedonian court, a viper's nest of ambition, violence, and constant plotting, and became part of that elite circle of royal pages, basilikoi paids. This was a system designed by Philip II to take the sons of noblemen as high-status hostages, educating them while also ensuring their father's loyalty. Most importantly, it meant Ptolemy and Alexander studied together, not just in the brutal, relentless Macedonian arts of war, but at the feet of the great Aristotle himself, whom Philip had famously hired to tutor his son and his companions at the Temple of the Nymphs at Mieza. This was not a formal state education. It was a philosophical and strategic forge where they learned logic, rhetoric, medicine, literature, and above all the lessons of the Iliad, internalizing the idea that they were the new Achilles destined for glory. This childhood friendship, this bond forged over Homeric texts, philosophical debates with the master, and the shared, brutal experiences of Macedonian training, would become the unlikely bedrock of a future empire. In this hyper-competitive environment, friendship was a form of alliance. Ptolemy, older and perhaps more level-headed, proved himself a stable, loyal, and intelligent companion to the brilliant, volatile young prince. He was part of the in crowd, a trusted member of an elite generation of young men who would one day be known to history as the Diadochi, the successors. He was not the only friend, of course. He shared this space with the dashing Hephaestion, the impetuous Cletus, and the cunning Seleucus. But his was a friendship that would endure exile, war, and the crucible of a decade-long campaign, positioning him perfectly for the cataclysmic opportunities that would follow. This raises the central question of Ptolemy's early military career. Was he just a bodyguard, a glorified spear carrier for his royal friend? Or was he one of Alexander's most brilliant and trusted military minds? The answer, like Ptolemy himself, is complex and practical. The truth is that to be a bodyguard for a king like Alexander meant being both. The role of somatophylax was not just a security detail. It was the most intimate and powerful circle of advisors. The senior generals who guarded the king's tent shared his counsels and were expected to lead major battlefield commands. Ptolemy's genius was perhaps not the brilliance of Alexander's lightning-fast tactical intuition, but something more valuable in the long run: steadfastness, logistical sense, and a deep, abiding loyalty that made him an indispensable component of the king's inner circle. When Alexander, following the assassination of his father Philip II, finally launched his audacious, seemingly impossible campaign against the vast Persian Empire in 334 BC, Ptolemy was at his side from the very beginning. He had shared Alexander's brief exile under Philip and returned in triumph with him. Now, as a mature man in his early 30s, he crossed the Hellespont as a trusted commander in an army that was setting out to conquer the known world. He was eventually elevated to one of the 7 elite somatophylax, the bodyguards. This title is deceptively modest to modern ears, implying a simple security role. In the Macedonian court, it was the highest honor, a rank above all other generals save the king himself. These 7 men were the inner circle, the men who guarded the king's person in battle, who shared his tent, and who acted as his de facto general staff. To be a somatophylax was to be one of the king's most trusted friends, a position of immense honor and influence, placing Ptolemy at the very center of the Macedonian war machine. He proved his worth in the key, world-changing battles that shattered the Persian Empire. From the tactical masterpiece at Issus in 333 BC to the final, empire-shattering clash at Gaugamela in 331 BC, throughout these major engagements, he cemented his reputation. He was a reliable, steady commander, not just a shield. He was not a flashy or reckless dashing general like some of the other younger companions who sought glory in risky charges. He was, by all accounts, older, more cautious, and more methodical. He understood logistics. He understood the importance of a secure flank. He was the man Alexander could trust to hold a position, to lead a difficult pursuit, or to undertake a complex logistical operation, proving that his value was not just in his personal loyalty, but in his deep, professional competence as a high-ranking military officer. After the Persian Empire was conquered, Alexander drove his army further east, into the unknown lands of Bactria, Sogdia, and finally, India. It was in these brutal, grinding, dirty wars, far from the open plains of Persia, that Ptolemy's reputation was solidified. He distinguished himself further in the difficult and bloody campaigns in India, particularly playing a crucial role in the operations against King Porus and his terrifying corps of war elephants at the Battle of the Hydaspes in 326 BC. By the time the weary, mutinous army finally turned back, Ptolemy's loyalty and tactical skill were undeniable. He had been there from the beginning. He had fought, he had bled, and he had never once wavered in his support for his king. Even when others were executed for alleged treason, he was one of Alexander's men, through and through, a veteran of the entire, world-changing 10-year campaign. The king is dead. The empire has no heir. This is the ultimate political nightmare. The scenario that turns allies into vipers overnight. What happens when the world's most powerful, ambitious, and battle-hardened generals, men who have just conquered the known world, are suddenly, without warning, unleashed from their single, unifying master? This was the situation in Babylon in 323 BC. The entire, massive, multi-ethnic empire was held together by a single thread: the personal genius, charisma, and divinity of Alexander. And now that thread was cut. In 323 BC, in the opulent, sweltering, and ancient palace of Nebuchadnezzar II in Babylon, Alexander the Great died suddenly. He was not cut down in battle, as the legends might have foretold, but succumbed to a raging, mysterious fever at the age of just 32. His body, undefeated by Persian arrows or Indian elephants, was likely broken by a decade of relentless campaigning, his countless wounds, and a culture of notoriously heavy drinking. The world, which he had held in his fist, was suddenly, terrifyingly, without its master. His final words, as reported by history, whether real or apocryphal, were a death sentence for his own empire. When asked by his generals, gathered around his deathbed, to whom he left his kingdom, he supposedly whispered to the strongest, or to the most worthy Cratistui. He had failed to name a clear successor, leaving only a vague, philosophical challenge. This was not a plan for succession, it was an invitation to anarchy. He left his kingdom to no one and, therefore, to everyone. He had a mentally disabled half-brother Philip III and an unborn child, Alexander IV, but in a world that only respected strength. These were not heirs. They were human shields, pawns to be used and discarded by the men with the biggest armies. Immediately, his generals, the Diadochi, or successors, began to circle the carcass of the empire. This group: Ptolemy, the one-eyed Antigonus, the regent Perdiccas, the cunning Seleucus, the brutal Lysimachus, and the rest were not politicians or diplomats. They were apex predators, men who had carved up the world with their spears and now saw no reason to stop. They were bound by a shared Macedonian heritage and a decade of shared war. But all bonds of loyalty dissolved the moment Alexander's breath left his body. The vast, contiguous empire, stretching from the Adriatic Sea to the Indus River, was now a prize to be torn apart. It was the ultimate Game of Thrones, and the players were the most experienced, ruthless, and ambitious generals in history. Some, like Perdiccas, would try to hold it all together in the name of a unified regency. Others, like Antigonus, would seek to claim the entire empire for themselves. And one, Ptolemy, would have a very different and much cleverer idea. For Ptolemy, the loyal friend, the steady commander, the age of conquest was over, the age of survival, the age of the successors had begun. A new, dangerous game was afoot. Friendship was now a casualty. Loyalty was a liability. The skills that had made him a great subordinate, steadfastness, caution, obedience, were now useless. He would have to cultivate a new set of skills: ruthless opportunism, far-sighted political cunning, and a willingness to betray the very men who were once his comrades in arms. This is the single most important question of the post-Alexander world. While others, like Perdiccas and Antigonus, fought for the grand, glittering, and ultimately impossible prize of the entire imperial crown, why did one general make a quiet, calculated, and seemingly modest move for a single province? This was Ptolemy's first and greatest stroke of genius. He did not let his ego overwhelm his strategic sense. He did not want the world. He wanted a defensible, profitable, and permanent kingdom. At the partition of Babylon, the first great, frantic conference where the generals divided the empire's territories, satrapies, among themselves, the central prize was the regency of the whole empire. Perdiccas, the most senior commander, seized it, attempting to hold the entire fragile structure together in the name of Alexander's phantom heirs. The other generals squabbled over the great, wealthy, and prestigious satrapies of Asia Minor and Persia. It was here that Ptolemy, quiet and calculating, made his brilliant move. He requested Egypt. He didn't demand the treasury. He didn't demand the imperial army. He didn't demand Macedon itself. He asked for the ancient, strange, and distant land of the pharaohs. He, who had traveled with Alexander to the oracle at Siwa, had seen this land firsthand and understood its unique, untapped potential. To the others, obsessed with the heartland of Persia and Macedon, it seemed like a modest, almost eccentric choice, a backwater, a retirement posting. To Ptolemy, it was the perfect fortress. He alone saw its true, unparalleled strategic potential. It was fabulously wealthy, the breadbasket of the Mediterranean, capable of producing massive, inexhaustible grain surpluses. It was fertile with the annual, predictable flood of the Nile, and most importantly, it was geographically isolated, protected on all sides by vast, impassable deserts, the Libyan and Arabian, and the sea. It was a kingdom in a box, a self-sufficient, highly defensible, and immensely profitable base of operations. How do you, a foreign Macedonian, convince a civilization of 3,000 years that you are their new, legitimate pharaoh? How do you stake your claim in the brutal wars of succession? You don't just win a battle, you win the propaganda war. You steal the body of a god. Alexander, who had been famously declared the son of the god Zeus Ammon by the Egyptian oracle at Siwa, was already a divinity in the eyes of the Egyptians. His body, therefore, was not just a corpse, it was the single most potent religious and political symbol in the world. It was being transported in a magnificent, custom-built golden sarcophagus, placed within an equally magnificent funeral carriage or catafalque, and it was a symbol of imperial legitimacy. The regency, under Perdiccas, was preparing this body for a spectacular journey from Babylon, not to Siwa as Alexander had wished, but back to the traditional royal burial ground in Macedon. In a stunning, audacious, and sacrilegious act of grand theft, Ptolemy hijacked the procession. As the magnificent funeral cortege made its slow way from Babylon in 321 BC, Ptolemy's army, under his command, intercepted it in Syria. He seized the carriage, the body, and all its treasures, and, against the explicit orders of the regent, diverted the conqueror's body to Egypt by possessing the body of the deified Alexander and by later entombing it in Memphis, and eventually in a spectacular mausoleum in his new capital. Ptolemy declared to the world, in the clearest possible terms, the regency of Perdiccas is illegitimate. The true spiritual successor to Alexander, the man fulfilling his divine wish, is me. He had secured the ultimate religious and political relic, and in doing so, he had drawn a line in the sand, daring his rivals to cross it. You stole the king's body. You stole the empire's richest province. You openly defied the imperial regent. Did they really think you wouldn't be punished? This was not just theft. It was a direct, unambiguous challenge to the authority of Perdiccas, an act of open, undeniable treason. It was an existential threat to the very idea of a unified empire. Perdiccas, the de jure ruler of the world, could not and would not let it stand. The regent, Perdiccas, was enraged. In 321 BC, barely 2 years after Alexander's death, he did exactly what Ptolemy had anticipated. He marched the full, united imperial army, the veteran, invincible Macedonian force that had conquered the Persian Empire, to the borders of Egypt, demanding retribution, the return of the king's body, and the head of the traitor, Ptolemy. This was Ptolemy's first great test. He was dramatically outnumbered, and his new, local army was unproven against the full might of the imperial forces. He was trapped, but he was a brilliant defensive strategist, and he used the one weapon that Perdiccas could not defeat, the Nile River. He had chosen his fortress well. He fortified the border crossing at Pelusium, turning the great river, with its treacherous currents, deep mud, and hidden dangers, into a deadly, uncrossable moat. Perdiccas's attempt to cross the Nile was a complete and utter catastrophe. He was a general of the open field, not a master of logistics, and he completely underestimated the river. His army, attempting to ford the water at night, was devastated by the deep, strong current. Soldiers were swept away by the sudden floods. They were mired in the thick, sucking mud, becoming easy targets for Ptolemy's missile troops. And, as the ancient historians vividly and horrifically recount, they were terrorized and devoured by the Nile's massive, ever-present crocodiles. The failure was so total, so humiliating, that Perdiccas's prestige was shattered. The invincible imperial army had lost thousands of men, not to a rival's spear, but to the river and its creatures. That night, his own senior commanders, including Seleucus, Ptolemy's future ally, mutinied, entered his tent, and assassinated him. Ptolemy had won. He had defended Egypt, and he had eliminated his greatest rival without ever having to defeat him in a pitched battle. He had let the Nile do his work for him. Securing Egypt from external threat was just the beginning. The fortress was safe. Now Ptolemy had to rule it. His genius was not just military, it was political and cultural. He needed to figure out how to control not just his Greek Macedonian soldiers, who formed his new military aristocracy, but the millions of native Egyptians who worked the land, and who saw him as just the latest in a long line of foreign conquerors. He skillfully suppressed internal revolts, establishing a firm, centralized, and highly efficient bureaucratic state to manage the Nile's grain production, which he now essentially controlled as his personal property. But unlike other, more arrogant conquerors, Ptolemy did not try to crush the local culture. He managed the powerful, ancient, and deeply influential Egyptian priesthood with consummate skill. adopting their customs, funding their temples, and most importantly, publicly honoring their gods. He began to masterfully blend his Macedonian kingship with the 3,000-year-old traditions of the pharaohs. He and his successors would be depicted on temple walls as traditional pharaohs, wearing the pshent, the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, making offerings to Horus and Isis. Simultaneously, they would present themselves to the Greek world as Hellenistic kings, patrons of art, philosophy, and gymnasiums. This new, hybrid Ptolemaic culture, a fusion of Greek logic and Egyptian divinity, would be the key to their long-term survival. Egypt itself was secure, but the wars of the Diadochi raged on for another 40 years. The successors were in a constant, shifting, kaleidoscopic dance of alliance and betrayal. The biggest threat to emerge from the chaos was the powerful Antigonus the One-Eyed, who along with his ambitious son Demetrius now controlled the Asian heartland and sought to do what Perdiccas had failed to do: reunite Alexander's empire under his own single rule. Ptolemy and Antigonus fought relentlessly for control of the Levant, the land bridge of Syria. Modern-day Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, and Jordan. This region was the buffer zone, the gateway to Egypt, and Ptolemy knew that to keep his kingdom safe, he must control this land bridge. It was the key to controlling the eastern Mediterranean, and it would be a flashpoint for war for the next century. At the Battle of Gaza in 312 BC, Ptolemy, with his friend and fellow general Seleucus, who had fled to Egypt after the assassination of Perdiccas, won a decisive, crushing victory over Antigonus's ambitious son, Demetrius. This battle was crucial. It proved Ptolemy was more than just a cautious defender. He was a brilliant field commander. The victory not only secured his buffer zone for a time, but, just as important, it allowed Seleucus to use the chaos to reclaim Babylon, from which he would found the great Seleucid Empire. Why was Ptolemy, a man who had stolen a corpse and ruthlessly carved out a kingdom, given the divine title Soter, or the Savior? It had nothing to do with his wars against the other generals, or his rule over the Egyptians. It all came down to one legendary siege, a spectacular display of loyalty to an ally. Antigonus's son, Demetrius, earned his famous nickname the Besieger Poliorcetes by laying siege to the island of Rhodes. In 305 BC, Rhodes was a wealthy, independent trading power and a crucial maritime ally of Ptolemy. Demetrius, a master of siegecraft, unleashed a terrifying array of massive, complex siege engines, including the famed Hellepolis, taker of cities, a 130-foot-tall ironclad tower on wheels, a Death Star of the ancient world. The siege was one of the most brutal and spectacular of the ancient world, but the Rhodians held on, fighting with desperate courage. Ptolemy, recognizing the immense strategic and symbolic importance of his ally, did not let them fall. His fleet, demonstrating his mastery of the sea, repeatedly broke the siege, sending supplies, reinforcements, and food, saving the city from certain destruction and starvation. After a year, a frustrated Demetrius gave up, abandoning his vast and expensive siege engines on the beach. In gratitude, the people of Rhodes, who had sold the abandoned engines to fund the Colossus of Rhodes, worshipped Ptolemy as a god and officially gave him the epithet Soter, Savior. The name stuck, defining his legacy. He was not just a conqueror, but a protector. The year is 305 BC. The last of Alexander's legitimate line, his young son Alexander IV, has been murdered by Cassander. The pretense of regency is over. The phantom heirs are gone. What stops a general from becoming a king? Absolutely nothing. Following the lead of Antigonus, Ptolemy officially declared himself King Basilius, or Pharaoh, to the Egyptians. He was no longer just a satrap governor ruling on behalf of a dead empire. He was the sovereign ruler of an independent kingdom, beholden to no one. This move stabilized his rule, formalizing the reality of his power. It was the final, brilliant step in his long con, seamlessly blending his Macedonian kingship with 3,000 years of Egyptian divine tradition. The Ptolemaic dynasty, which would see his descendants rule as god-kings, had officially begun. How do you build a new capital from scratch, one designed to rival the ancient glories of Athens and Babylon? You build it in the name of your dead king, you place his tomb at its center, and you make it the center of the world. Alexander himself had technically founded the city, tracing its outlines in the dust in 331 BC, but at his death, it was little more than a plan. It was Ptolemy who became its true founder. Ptolemy, as king, poured the immense, inexhaustible wealth of Egypt into creating Alexandria. This was not to be just a new Egyptian city. It was designed to be the new, brilliant capital of the entire Hellenistic world, a beacon of Greek culture, learning, and commerce. With its magnificent, double strategic harbor on the Mediterranean, its wide, grid-planned streets, its opulent royal palaces, and of course, the tomb of Alexander the Sema at its heart, it quickly became a melting pot. It was deliberately designed as a beacon of Greek, Egyptian, and Jewish culture, hosting the largest Jewish population in the world, and, thanks to its position, it became the undisputed center of commerce for the entire known world. But Ptolemy's greatest ambitions weren't just stone and gold. They were knowledge. He was a product of Aristotle's tutelage, after all, and he understood that power came not just from spears and grain, but from ideas. He established the Museum, or Shrine of the Muses, a revolutionary, state-funded center for research, a think tank that invited the greatest scholars, poets, and scientists from across the Greek world. Attached to the Museum, he began the project that would define his legacy, the Great Library of Alexandria. Its goal was not just to store books, it was a fanatical, state-sponsored mission to collect all the world's knowledge, to acquire and translate every scroll from every culture into Greek, from the Septuagint to the histories of Babylon. Alongside the library, he commissioned, and his son completed, the Pharaoh's Lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. This colossal tower, standing over 350 feet tall, used a massive mirror to reflect sunlight or a fire at night and guided ships into the city's complex harbor. It was a practical tool of commerce, but it was also a powerful, inescapable symbol of his dynasty. Alexandria was now the light of the world. In his later, peaceful years, what did the king of Egypt do? He had won his wars, built his city, and secured his kingdom. He became an author, the soldier king, the friend of Alexander, the pharaoh, sat down and wrote his own history of Alexander's campaigns. It was said to be a sober, factual, and professional account from a true eyewitness, a general's perspective, likely written in part to counter the more fantastical, romanticized versions of the king's life that were already circulating, and no doubt to center his own role in the epic. Tragically, this priceless, first-hand history is now lost, along with all the other histories written by Alexander's generals. It survives only in fragments, quoted heavily by later, surviving historians like Arrian, who considered it one of his most reliable and important sources. A general's final battle is not with swords. It is with time. It is the battle for securing his legacy. Ptolemy had seen, firsthand, the catastrophic chaos that followed Alexander's death. He was determined not to let that happen to his own hard-won kingdom. He carefully and ruthlessly managed the transition of power. This required a difficult choice. He sidelined his eldest son, the volatile and dangerous Ptolemy Kuranos the Thunderbolt, and chose Ptolemy II Philadelphus, his younger, more cultured and stable son, from his favored wife, Berenice. To ensure there was no question, no civil war upon his death, he did something almost unprecedented. He made Ptolemy II co-regent into 85 BC. Years before his own death, this ensured a smooth, peaceful, and public handover of power, an absolute rarity in the violent, treacherous, and fratricidal world of the Hellenistic kingdoms. What is the final legacy of the boy from Macedon? Ptolemy I Soter, the savior, the king, the pharaoh, the author, the friend of Alexander, died peacefully in his bed in his new capital of Alexandria, round to 80 BC. He was 84 or 85 years old. He was one of the only original Diadochi, one of the only generals who had ridden out of Macedon, with Alexander to die of old age. All the others, Antigonus, Perdiccas, Lysimachus, Seleucus, died violently, in battle or by an assassin's knife. The dynasty he forged, the House of Ptolemy, would rule Egypt for nearly 300 years, a staggering length of time. It would only end finally and spectacularly with the death of his most famous and final descendant, Cleopatra VII, who Like her great-great-grandfather was a brilliant, ruthless, and charismatic ruler who understood the complex interplay of power, culture, and divinity. The general's legacy had outlived them all. He had not won the empire, but he had won the game.